I only needed shelter, but that walnut block seemed to know my family.
No room, no family, no coat thick enough for November, just a canvas backpack and $5 she had earned washing mugs after closing. And with that $5, she bought a condemned pistol-stock Carver's cabin outside Harpers Ferry, Jefferson County, West Virginia, gone from county maps since 1968. Half the roof bowed toward the road. The chimney had split above the flashing. Condemned on October 3, 2022, it was marked for demolition the following spring. But beneath a burl in an oversized walnut block, a sealed hollow had waited through 3 silent generations, holding money, silver, and a set of instructions meant for hands not yet born. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Phoebe Mercer had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. Her mother died when Phoebe was 6, leaving behind a blue enamel hairbrush, a recipe for apple butter, and a silence her father never learned to enter. He worked long shifts at a tire warehouse near Martinsburg and came home with rubber dust in the seams of his hands. When he remarried, Phoebe learned to make herself useful before anyone could call her a burden. Her father was not cruel. Cruelty required a steadiness he did not possess. He avoided conflict by looking elsewhere and trusting danger to pass. On Saturdays, Phoebe escaped to her grandfather Elias Mercer's shed beyond Shepherdstown, where the windows were filmed with linseed oil and fine walnut dust. Elias repaired broken chair backs, dulcimer pegs, and once, for a museum volunteer, the split stock of an old flintlock pistol. He wore one brass watch key on a cord around his neck and sharpened his chisels on a waterstone before sunrise. Their ritual was simple. She swept the bench. He boiled coffee. Then he placed a scrap of black walnut between them and asked her to find the grain with her thumb before she touched a tool. By noon, the shed smelled of coffee, walnut, and steel. Wood tells the truth before people do, Elias once said. He meant that pressure always left a mark, and that careful hands could learn where something had been forced. He died in March when Phoebe was 15, after a winter of coughing he had dismissed as age. The shed was cleared before the funeral flowers browned. His planes, gouges, walnut blanks, notebooks, and the watch key disappeared into an estate sale, arranged by her father's new wife. Phoebe was given the dented coffee pot because nobody else wanted it. Marlene Mercer entered a room quietly and altered its temperature. She kept every receipt, folded dish towels into exact thirds, and spoke most gently when she had already decided what would happen. She never struck Phoebe. She corrected her posture, counted slices of bread, and moved family photographs until Phoebe's mother vanished from the hallway. By Phoebe's 19th year, Marlene had made the house orderly enough that one person's absence could look like improvement. The accusation came on November 7th. A velvet jewelry box sat open on the kitchen table, its cream lining empty except for one broken clasp. Beside it lay Phoebe's backpack, unzipped, with a gold bracelet arranged across the top of her clothes. Her father stood by the sink, gripping a drinking glass with both hands. Marlene rested one finger on the box. "You stole from us. Leave before sunrise tomorrow." 8 words. Phoebe counted them because counting was easier than answering. She lifted the bracelet by its cold hinge and placed it beside the box. Her father watched the movement, but not her face. When she looked at him, he lowered the glass and wiped a dry circle from the counter. That was his betrayal. Not speech, not anger, only the small housekeeping gesture of a man preparing the room for what would remain. Phoebe packed the enamel hairbrush, Elias's coffee pot, 2 shirts, and a blanket thin as paper. At dawn, Marlene stood behind the curtain without opening it. Phoebe saw the fabric move once. Then she walked east with $5 in her pocket and frost whitening the roadside grass. For 6 weeks, she learned the private geography of being unwanted. In Charlestown, she slept behind a laundromat where warm air leaked from a vent until the manager found her at 4 in the morning. In Martinsburg, she spent $1.35 on oatmeal and rode a city bus to the final stop, then stayed beneath the stairwell of a parking garage until footsteps drove her out. In Brunswick, Maryland, she curled inside an unlocked maintenance shed near the rail yard, waking whenever freight couplers struck with a sound like iron doors. Her money became $3, then $1.80, then 2 quarters wrapped in a receipt. She washed in library restrooms, dried her socks under hand blowers, and learned which churches left vestibules open after evening service. Hunger sharpened smells. Bread from a bakery vent could stop her in the street. On December 19th, rain pushed her into the Bolivar Harpers Ferry Public Library. She chose a table near the radiator and opened the local classifieds, because the newspaper was free. Between an ad for split oak and another for a broken garden tractor, a 4-line notice offered one condemned structure. Contents included: tax transfer fee waived, buyer responsible for removal or repair, price $5. The address ended on Bakerton Road. She read the notice 3 times, then turned the paper toward the window, as though better light might reveal the joke. At the bottom was a county clerk's number and a deadline of noon the next day. Phoebe touched the 2 quarters in her pocket, folded the classified into a square, and decided she would reach the courthouse before the demolition file closed. By morning, the rain had frozen and the road toward Harpers Ferry shone like a blade. The first bus carried Phoebe 12 miles before the driver told her the bridge route had been cut by ice. She stepped down beside a shuttered feed store with the folded classified inside her glove and walked the remaining 9 miles, along roads where frozen runoff had gathered in the wheel ruts. Her shoes admitted water before noon. Near Halltown, a farmer let her sleep above a hay barn after finding her beneath his equipment lean-to. The thermometer nailed outside the milking room read 18 degrees. He gave her a horse blanket, half biscuit, wrapped in wax paper, and no questions. At first light, she descended the ladder with hay caught in her hair and reached Harpers Ferry while the church clocks were striking 9. The town seemed built from steepness: stone steps, narrow porches, roofs rising behind roofs. She passed Dorsey's Pharmacy, Shenandoah Dry Goods, Potomac Shoe Repair, the Blue Heron Cafe, and Bell and Finch Hardware in less than 3 blocks. Warm windows held ordinary lives she could see but not enter. The Jefferson County Clerk's Annex occupied a square brick building uphill from the river. Inside, wet boots had darkened the tile near a brass radiator. Phoebe stood beneath a clock that ran 4 minutes slow until a woman behind the counter raised one hand without looking up. The clerk had silver hair cut bluntly at the jaw and a small ink stain beside her left thumbnail. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Adeline Voss. You are here about the Bakerton Road parcel. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Voss opened a gray folder and aligned its corners with the counter. You understand? There is no electrical service. Yes, ma'am. You understand the well has not been tested since 1987. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not insure the structure or remove debris. Yes, ma'am. You understand that if the roof fails, the liability becomes yours. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Voss examined Phoebe's wet sleeves, then the 2 quarters she had placed beside the folded advertisement. The listed purchase amount is $5. Phoebe drew the remaining bills from the lining of Elias's coffee pot. The money was softened by rain and handling, but it added correctly. Mrs. Voss counted it twice, stamped the deed with a brass seal that struck the paper like a small hammer, and slid a receipt across the counter. Take Washington Street west, turn toward Bakerton, then follow Bakerton Road past the old quarry gate. There is a gravel lane on the left after the second culvert. No mailbox. The walnut trees begin at the property line. Phoebe folded the deed carefully. Mrs. Voss did not release her end of the folder. "Mercer," she said. "Any relation to Elias Mercer?" Phoebe looked up. "He was my grandfather." The clerk's fingers loosened. For several seconds, only the radiator clicked. Mrs. Voss turned toward a filing cabinet, opened the third drawer, and removed a photograph, curled at the corners. It showed 6 men outside a woodworking shed, each holding a tool. Elias stood at one end, younger but unmistakable, with the same brass key hanging from his neck. "He came here in 1989 asking about that cabin," Mrs. Voss said. "He wanted the ownership chain and every closure notice back to reconstruction. Sat where you were standing for most of an afternoon." "Did he say why?" "He said he was looking for work that had been left unfinished." Mrs. Voss tapped the name written in pencil beneath the photograph. Elias Mercer, apprentice restorer. He never bought it. The tax title was tangled then. But he returned twice, always in March, and asked whether anyone had opened the workshop. Phoebe glanced down at the new deed. Did anyone? No. The clerk placed the photograph inside the folder before closing it. "Your grandfather knew what stood on that land. That is more than I can say for the county." Outside, the ice had begun falling from the eaves in thin, glassy strips. Phoebe carried the deed beneath her coat and followed Washington Street until the houses thinned, then turned onto Bakerton Road. A mile beyond the quarry gate, an elderly man in a red knit cap was stacking split locust near a stone wall. A yellow hound watched her, from beside the woodpile, lifting one paw but making no sound. "You headed for the Carver's place?" the man asked. Phoebe nodded. He set down a log. 2 fingers were missing from his right hand. Lane's easy to miss. Dog knows it. The hound walked with her as far as the second culvert, then stopped where the first black walnut trees leaned over the ditch. Their trunks were dark and furrowed, their bare branches holding a few shriveled husks that knocked together in the wind. The gravel lane had nearly vanished beneath broom sedge. Phoebe followed it uphill for 200 yards before the cabin appeared. It was longer than she had expected, about 24 feet by 36, built of hand-hewn oak logs resting on a low fieldstone foundation. Weathered clapboards covered the front wall, though half had loosened and curled away like bark. The cedar shake roof sagged over the center beam, and one corner had been covered with rusted sheet metal held down by stones. A narrow brick chimney rose from the east wall, split through 6 courses. Above the door hung a blackened plank sign. Under the moss, she could still read Mercer and Vale, pistol stocks, fitted and carved. The surname stopped her at the foot of the steps. She touched the letters once, then pushed the door. The hinges answered with a dry iron cry. Cold air moved past her, carrying old glue, mouse nests, damp ash, and something faintly mineral that reminded her of spent fireworks after rain. The front room held a brick hearth, a scarred work table, and shelves bowed by the weight of walnut offcuts. Dust softened every edge. When she crossed the floor, one plank dipped beneath her heel with a low complaint. In the back room, daylight entered through a broken pane and struck 3 unfinished pistol stocks mounted in wooden vices. Their curves had been roughed out but never smoothed. Rust had bloomed over the chisels beside them. A large walnut block lay beneath a canvas sheet near the far wall, so broad that it looked intended for something heavier than a pistol. Phoebe tried to lift one end. It did not move. She found the well behind the cabin under a leaning roof of split shingles. The rope had rotted through, but a pebble dropped into the darkness struck water after 4 seconds. The outhouse door stood open to the woods. Inside the cabin, no tap worked because there were no taps, and no switch failed because there were no switches. Before dusk, she swept one patch of floor with a bundle of dried grass. She stuffed newspaper into the broken window, laid her thin blanket beside the hearth, and ate the last half of the farmer's biscuit in 4 measured bites. The cold settled first in her fingers, then along her spine. Somewhere behind the wall, a mouse worked patiently at paper. Phoebe placed Elias's coffee pot beneath her head and held the deed inside her coat. Through the roof, one star appeared between 2 missing shakes. She listened to the floor shift, the walnut branches scrape the siding, and the river moving unseen below the ridge. The place had not been abandoned. It had been waiting. For the first 3 days, Phoebe did not disturb the covered walnut block. She learned the property in smaller ways. The well bucket struck a submerged stone unless lowered against the north wall. The outhouse leaned but held. Inside, the floor announced its weaknesses by pitch. A click near the table, a hollow groan beside the hearth, and one long complaint outside the back room where a joist had softened. By the 3rd night, she could cross the cabin in darkness without waking the mice. On the 4th morning, she carried a rusted chisel to Bell and Finch Hardware. The store smelled of kerosene, cedar shavings, and coffee kept too long on a hot plate. Behind the counter stood Amos Bell, a broad man with a white mustache divided around one missing tooth. He examined the blade beneath a hanging lamp. Steel is good. Neglect is not the same as ruin. Phoebe set down her deed receipt. I need rope, matches, chimney brushes, lamp oil, and enough food to work. Amos opened a ledger. I can give you 30 days. I cannot promise 30-day money. Then promise 30-day honesty. She signed. Her account began with stove chain at $110, manila rope for $385, 2 chimney rods at $240 each, a wire brush for $475, lamp oil for $125, and cornmeal for 68 cents. Amos sharpened the chisel without charge and added a green manual titled Home Repairs for Rural Properties. Free with the bad judgment. Back at the cabin, Phoebe read the chimney chapter 3 times. She tied a flour sack beneath the fireplace throat, climbed a borrowed ladder, and fed the brush downward 1 rod at a time. Before lowering the brush, she tied a second cord to its eye. The manual warned that a lost brush could block a flue more completely than soot. On the roof, the cedar shakes flexed beneath her knees, and she kept her weight over the rafters by following the old nail lines. It stopped 6 feet below the crown. She twisted clockwise, lifted, and drove again. Black flakes struck the sack below. Some were brittle as burned paper. Others came down in glazed curls, hard as tar. She worked from 10 until after 3, warming her fingers beneath her arms. When the brush reached the smoke shelf, she drew it through 12 full times, scraped the firebox seams, and carried 3 buckets of creosote outside. At dusk, she laid dry walnut offcuts over twisted newspaper and touched a match beneath them. The first flame bent toward the room. Then the draft caught and smoke climbed cleanly past the damper. She watched warmth return to each knuckle. Her first hot meal was cornmeal boiled with well water and salt Amos had folded into paper. She ate from Elias's coffee pot while fire moved the tool shadows across the wall. The next morning, she entered the workroom with a rag and broom. She saved only what mattered. A backsaw with an applewood handle, a narrow V-gouge for checkering, a hand-forged barrel channel scraper, a brace with spoon bits, a horn vial of lamp black, 2 unfinished pistol stocks held in vices, and a paper pattern pricked along the curve of a grip. Beneath the bench lay a silver-colored butt plate wrapped in rotted felt. Last stood the walnut block beneath the canvas. It was nearly 5 feet long, 14 inches thick, and broader at one end, perhaps intended for an oversized wall gun. Phoebe brushed the canvas before folding it. Elias had taught her never to drag grit across wood. The grain curled tightly around a dark burl near the middle. She tapped the block with the saw handle. The butt end answered with a dense note. Beneath the burl came a lower sound that seemed to hold an extra breath. She raised each end onto a stool and balanced the block across a pipe. The heavy end should have settled toward the broad grain, but it tipped inward. Something inside had shifted the weight. After brushing away dust, she found a circle disguised among the burl's eyes, no wider than a teacup. Dark wax filled its seam. A cedar pin closed the center. Phoebe heated the V-gouge at the hearth, wiped it clean, and lifted the wax by fractions. Sweet resin rose into the room. She fitted a spoon bit into the brace and turned it gently against the pin. After 6 revolutions, it loosened. The circular disc lifted beneath her chisel. Behind it lay a cavity lined with oiled linen. Phoebe sat back. Water dripped from the eave outside. The first package contained 4 tools wrapped in wool: a lock mortise chisel, a bent gouge, a twin-toothed checkering cutter, and a palm knife with a walnut handle. Their greased steel remained bright. The second held 3/4 sawn walnut blanks marked with grain direction, moisture date, and the words "Do not rush." One blank carried a faint crescent cut where an apprentice had tested a gouge, then stopped before spoiling the grain. Behind them rested a flat tin box and a leather notebook tied with linen thread. Beneath the notebook lay a silver breech cap cast with a raised dragon curling around the screw plate. Phoebe placed each item on the bench in the order removed. The tin lid released beneath both thumbs. Inside were paper rolls, cloth packets, and coins nested too tightly to make a sound. She counted once, then again. There were $20 gold double eagles, $10 eagles, silver Morgan dollars, and walking Liberty, $half. Notes were folded beneath them by denomination. At the bottom lay a purple heart dated 1944, its ribbon faded toward brown. She separated the coins into rows on a clean flour sack, turning every piece face up before entering it. The procedure steadied her hands more than the amount did. Phoebe recorded each amount in the margin of the green manual. The total was $27,100. She counted a third time and reached the same number. She did not open the leather notebook. At dusk, she returned the money to the tin, wrapped the tools, and placed the metal on top. Carrying the unopened notebook beneath her coat, she followed the slope until the Shenandoah and Potomac showed through the bare trees. The rivers held separate colors for several hundred yards before joining. She sat on a cold stone and watched both currents take the moon without asking which water had come from where. The place had not been abandoned. It had been waiting. At first light, Phoebe set the leather notebook beside the hearth and warmed her hands before touching it. The linen thread broke with almost no sound. Inside the cover lay a folded letter, its paper browned at the edges. She knew the handwriting before she read a word. Elias had written her birthday cards in the same deliberate slant, each capital letter shaped as though cut with a narrow chisel. My dear one, whoever you are, Dr. Miriam Cole at City Hospital in Baltimore has told me the cancer has entered my lungs and liver. She has been honest, and I am grateful for honesty when time has become exact. I am writing on March 14th, 1991, because there are matters that should not be left to dust or county files. The shop began with Silas Vail, born in 1818 near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He came to Harpers Ferry in 1842 and learned lock-fitting at the armory. His daughter Ruth Vail Mercer, born in 1878, kept the carving benches after her brothers left for Ohio. Her son Amos Mercer worked here until he was killed in France in 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne fighting. Amos's son Daniel reopened the room in 1921, and Daniel taught me what remained before the trade closed on September 30th, 1958. After that date, the cabin stood silent for more than 30 years. If you have opened the walnut block, you have already shown restraint. That matters more than strength. Black walnut must be dried below 8% moisture before final fitting. Cut the barrel channel in shallow passes and leave 1/64 of an inch for scraping. Bed the recoil shoulder with 2 parts hide glue to 1 part fine walnut dust. Warmed but never boiled. After checkering, rub in boiled linseed oil once each day for 7 days, then once each week for 7 weeks. The notebook beside this letter contains a mortise pattern for carrying recoil through the whole stock, instead of allowing the force to break one narrow wrist. The silver dragon cap was made for a presentation pistol that was never completed. Keep it, sell it, or melt it. An inheritance is not an order from the dead. It is work placed within reach, so the living may decide whether their hands are willing. The money was saved from commissions, repair wages, and one government payment I never spent. Use only what protects the roof, the chimney, your health, and the work itself. Leave the rest where another careful person may someday find it. I looked for someone in my family who might understand this place. I found only fear, haste, and men who confused ownership with keeping. Perhaps you are family. Perhaps you are not. Wood does not ask for a surname before it accepts a careful cut. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Nathaniel. Mercer. March 14, 1991. Phoebe read the letter twice. The second time, she stopped where Elias had written the word family, not because it comforted her, but because he had left room around it. She folded the paper along its original creases, pressed each edge with her thumbnail, and returned it to the notebook without adding a new line. Behind the cabin, the frost had begun lifting from the ground. The letter described a boundary marker beneath the eastern walnut, 3 paces from the stone, shaped like a boot. Phoebe found the stone under dead fern. 3 paces beyond it, moss covered a low sandstone block bearing a shallow carving, a flintlock hammer above a walnut leaf. Someone had kept the mark close to the earth, where only a person searching carefully would see it. She carried Elias's old coffee pot outside, filled it with dry walnut shavings, and set one curled shaving alight. The flame traveled slowly around the dented rim, brightening the enamel where years of smoke had darkened it. She did not burn the pot. She let the shaving finish, then wiped the ash away with her sleeve. Small mercies returned to her by their objects. The farmer's horse blanket still lay folded beside the hearth. Mrs. Voss had stamped a deed instead of dismissing a wet girl with 2 quarters. Amos Bell had written credit beneath her name and sharpened a tool he did not own. Even the man with 2 missing fingers had sent his yellow hound far enough to show her the hidden lane. Before this story moves forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they did not have to. A meal, a ride, a warm room, or simply a person who believed your word. Tell us about it in the comments. And if you still can, pass that same kindness to someone who will remember the object, the gesture, and the silence around it. That night, Phoebe wrapped the 4 bright tools in Elias's letter and placed the silver dragon cap beside her blanket. The purple heart rested inside the coffee pot near her head. For the first time since November, she slept without wearing her shoes. The first snow came on December 2nd and measured 7 inches against the stone step. Phoebe woke before dawn to a ceiling darkened by meltwater. She set 3 pots beneath the drips, opened the green repair manual, and read the roofing chapter 3 times before touching a ladder. The cabin roof measured 24 by 36 feet, with 2 slopes and a modest overhang. Allowing for pitch and waste, she calculated 16 squares of cedar shingles, 4 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 28 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Amos checked her figures, crossed out 2 needless boxes, and placed a roofing hatchet on the counter. "My brother's," he said. "Dead 12 years. It should work." A former roofer named Warren Pike arrived the next morning in a canvas coat, polished pale at the elbows. He had a left eye clouded by an old injury and refused both money and explanation. "You hold the ladder," he said. "I'll teach." They worked 11 days. Warren showed her how to sister the split center rafter with straight white oak, tightening the pair with carriage bolts instead of trusting nails and tired timber. They snapped a chalk line every 5 courses, staggered each joint, and drove every nail in 3 strokes. Seat, set, stop. On the 3rd day, he tapped 1 shingle with the flat of his hatchet. "That nail's proud." Phoebe reached for the claw. "Pull it." They finished on December 14th beneath a hard blue sky. The last cedar shingle settled against the ridgeboard without rocking. That night, snow began again, but no water fell into the pots. By January, the chimney face had begun shedding itself. Frost pushed the outer bricks apart, and several crumbled beneath Phoebe's thumb. Mortar sifted from the joints like gray flour. Warren told her not to patch lime with modern cement. Amos found 2 sacks of hydraulic lime in a back storeroom and sold them at cost. Phoebe mixed 3 parts washed sand to 1 part lime for the exterior joints, then added 1 part fire clay to 2 parts hydraulic lime inside the smoke chamber, where heat demanded a tighter bond. She raked every failing joint to the depth of 3/4 of an inch, brushed out the powder, dampened the brick, and packed new mortar with a narrow pointing trowel. The temperature stayed in the 20s for 3 weeks. Every 15 minutes, her bare hands went numb, and she had to close them beneath her coat until pain returned. A cracked flue tile forced her to remove 2 courses above the roof line. Warren stood below and watched the bricks descend in a rope sling. "Slow is cheaper," he called. Phoebe rebuilt the crown with a slight outward slope so rain would move away from the clay liner. She covered each fresh section with damp burlap at night and uncovered it at midday to prevent a hard surface skin. On January 29th, they lit the test fire with dry oak kindling and 1 twisted page from an obsolete tax notice. The flame drew immediately. Smoke climbed clean through the repaired throat and vanished above the roof without touching the room. Phoebe stood near the hearth until the bricks warmed. The front room floor was white pine, though years of soot had turned it nearly black. Many boards were sound beneath the surface, held by hand-cut rose-head nails, whose irregular heads caught the light when Phoebe scraped around them. She rented a random orbit sander from Amos for $14 per day. The machine pulled harder than expected, and during the first pass it carried her almost to the wall. She learned to guide rather than fight it. She sanded with 80 grit to remove grime and old finish, then 120 to erase the coarse marks. The final pass, at 220 grit, revealed grain that had been hidden for half a century. Around the rose-head nails, she worked by hand with folded paper, so the iron remained seated. 3 coats of boiled linseed oil followed. She warmed each small batch near the hearth, rubbed it thin with cotton cloth, and removed every wet patch after 20 minutes. The floor cured for 48 hours between coats. Its color changed slowly from dark honey toward mahogany. One morning, the sander remained unplugged. Phoebe had awakened tired enough to make mistakes, so she walked to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in shallow water, motionless except for one deliberate step at a time. She watched until noon and did no work that day. The next morning, the floor was still there. 8 windows remained in the cabin. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes that rattled in their channels. 1 small upper pane, wavy and faintly green, was original to 1788 and would not be replaced. Phoebe removed each sash, numbered it in pencil, and scraped the old putty only after warming it with a wrapped hot water bottle. For the new panes, she rolled DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms, pressed a thin bedding layer into the rabbet, set the glass against the glazing points, then drew the putty knife in one clean line from corner to corner. The sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. Amos cut her 1/4-inch cotton cord, and Warren showed her how to feed it over the pulley, tie a figure-8 knot through the cast-iron counterweight, and leave enough length for the sash to close without striking the pocket floor. She preserved the 1788 pane exactly where it was. Its small bubbles bent the February light and made the walnut trees outside appear to move beneath water. On the final window, Phoebe tightened the last screw and tested the sash twice. It rose without binding and stayed where she placed it. A chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside, close enough for her to see the black cap, white cheek, and quick opening of its beak. It remained there while she wiped one line of putty from the glass. The walls beside the chimney had shed their skin in gray scales, exposing hand-split oak lath and old horsehair plaster. Phoebe failed 3 times. One patch cracked overnight, one sagged, and one released when the bricks warmed. Amos brought an old sack of horsehair from his barn. She washed and teased the strands apart, then mixed them into lime plaster. She pressed a scored scratch coat through the lath, followed with a 3/8-inch brown coat cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours, and finished with a 1/8-inch coat, worked smooth by steel trowel. When it held, she ran her palm across it. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Hale of the Blue Heron Cafe wore red reading glasses on a beaded cord. Twice a week, she left paper bags on the doorstep, biscuits, eggs, heel slices of ham, sometimes an apple. When Phoebe tried to pay, Doris pushed the coins back with one floury finger. In candles, when the shop reopens, Caleb Morris arrived on a blue Schwinn with a splitting maul across the handlebars. 16 and narrow as a fence rail, he split a winter's oak and stacked it barkside up beneath the lean-to. Phoebe offered him money. He shook his head. "My mother said, about your grandfather." Reverend Boyd passed each morning in a brown overcoat, silver beard moving above one squeaking shoe. At the lane he tipped his hat. One snowy morning he raised 2 fingers. "Keep these hands steady." Then he walked on. Phoebe postponed the cellar until February 11th, when frozen ground stopped runoff beneath the door. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor. At the center lay a dressed slab, carved with the flintlock hammer and walnut leaf. Its edges were too exact for ordinary flooring. She did not lift it. Her broom caught a small oak box beneath the 3rd step. Inside rested a brass key, whose bow was shaped like a flintlock cock, and a tintype from 1903. A young woman stood outside the cabin holding a checkering cutter. Her eyes, mouth, and blunt jaw were so like Phoebe's that the likeness felt unfinished. On the back, Ruth Vale Mercer, daughter of Silas Vale, age 25, summer of 1903. The key fit no door, chest, or tin box. Phoebe left it on the mantel beside the silver dragon cap. For the time being, not knowing was allowed. In March, snow retreated from the north wall. The creek grew loud, and the walnuts opened pale catkins. Phoebe cleaned the inherited tools and copied Elias's mortise pattern, but she would not begin a full stock that spring. Skill borrowed from the dead still had to pass through living hands. She exchanged one worn Morgan dollar for scrap walnut, chalk, lamp black, and 2 narrow files. On pieces no longer than her palm, she practiced straight channels, shallow mortises, and checkering lines that wandered less each week. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, In December 2024, Phoebe finished her first complete stock. It was not for sale. She built it around a harmless museum pattern using black walnut seasoned above the hearth for 18 months. The barrel channel ran true, the wooden practice lock seated without binding. Elias's hidden recoil joint carried force through the body of the stock, instead of concentrating it at the wrist. Phoebe cut 18-line checkring, rubbed in oil by hand, and waited 7 days before touching it again. On Christmas morning, she set it beneath the shop sign and found no reason to improve it. The cabin had changed without becoming polished. The white pine floor held dark warmth. Plaster followed the old walls instead of pretending they were straight. Tools hung by use, not size. One shelf held Elias's letter, Ruth's tintype, the Purple Heart, and the silver dragon cap. The brass key remained unexplained until a storm split a limb from the eastern walnut. While trimming the torn branch, Phoebe's saw struck metal beneath the bark. She cleared moss from a narrow brass plate grown into the trunk. The key entered with resistance, then turned. A shallow compartment opened inside the living wood. There was no money. A folded 48-star flag lay in oilcloth beside a note dated October 18, 1918. Ruth had written after word arrived that her brother Amos had died in France. She wrote that the flag hung in the shop window for 3 weeks, though rain entered the roof and spoiled 2 blanks. Amos had taught her to sharpen a by pulling steel away from its edge. Grief, she wrote, was another kind of recoil. Force arriving faster than the body could receive it. If this tree keeps the flag, let it also keep the truth that work continued. Daniel is small, but he watches my hands. I will teach him when he is ready. Phoebe returned the flag in fresh oilcloth and fitted the compartment with cedar lining and a waxed seal. On November 11, 2025, she carried the Purple Heart to Arlington National Cemetery. A records volunteer had confirmed Amos Mercer's service and the later transfer of his remains. At the family marker, Phoebe placed one walnut shaving beneath a stone, stood through the 11 o'clock silence, and brought the metal home. She used only 4 coins from the cash. 1 covered roof materials beyond her credit. 1 bought kiln-dried walnut. A third paid records fees and train fare. The 4th became glass, felt, and hinges for a fireproof box beneath the bench. The remaining money returned to the walnut block with Elias's notebook, a copy of Ruth's note, and Phoebe's ledger of repairs. On the cedar disc, she carved, "For the next one." The shop reopened without ceremony. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard. Walnut repairs, tool handles, historic woodwork. Ask for Phoebe. The first job was a cracked chair stretcher. The second was a dulcimer bridge. By summer, more than 40 names filled a mailing list, mostly people willing to wait because the work was exact. Phoebe accepted no modern gunwork. She restored stocks for museums, repaired heirloom boxes, cut tool handles, and taught visitors to read grain before lifting a chisel. Some paid cash. Others brought eggs, seasoned walnut, lamp oil, or time. Caleb returned in October with sawdust in his hair and a cedar board tied across his schwinn. He had grown broad through the shoulders, though the same chipped tooth showed when he smiled. The board carried that old name, Mercer and Valapistol stocks, fitted and carved below it on a separate strip, and daughters Phoebe studied the plural. "There's only one of me." Caleb leaned the sign against the wall. Not forever. He refused payment, accepted coffee, and helped her hang it beneath the eave. They kept the original blackened plank inside above the bench. That winter, Phoebe began her own letter. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote about the bowed roof, the chimney mortar, and the floorboard that still clicked beside the hearth. She recorded the lime ratio, the grain direction of the remaining blanks, Doris's bags, Amos Bell's credit, Warren's hatchet, Caleb's sign, and Reverend Boyd's prayer. She did not explain Marlene or her father. Some absences needed no inheritance. She wrote that careful work could carry force farther than one frightened person should bear alone. Then she folded the pages, tied them with linen thread, and placed them beside Elias's notebook. The place had not been abandoned. It had been waiting. At dusk, Phoebe closed the shutters, banked the fire, and rested one hand on the walnut block before lowering the lamp. Outside, the creek moved beneath thin ice, and the new sign shifted once in the wind. The flintlock pistol stock Carver's cabin waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Mrs. Voss kept Phoebe's original $5 bill in the back of her desk drawer, flattened beneath the 1989 photograph of Elias Mercer. The brass stamp had darkened with use, but the bill remained soft at its folds, proof that a legal transfer could be small enough to fit beneath one hand.